In August 1947, immediately after the partition of the Indian subcontinent, war broke out between the newly independent nations of India and Pakistan for possession of the princely state of Kashmir. As a result of the war, Kashmir's status as sovereign polity ended and its territory was forcibly partitioned by India and Pakistan to zones of occupation separated by a UN ceasefire line. But as Pakistan was determined to take control of the whole of Kashmir, high tensions remained, and in subsequent years, Indian and Pakistani forces engaged in many armed clashes, the most significant being the war in 1965, where Pakistani forces failed to gain Kashmir, and the 1971 war, where the fighting in Kashmir played a minor role to the fighting in East Pakistan, which later became independent Bangladesh. The 1971 war produced the Simla Agreement of 1972, where India and Pakistan agreed to abide by the 1947 ceasefire line, which was renamed the Line of Control, or LOC, which became the de facto border between India-administered Kashmir and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Another flare-up occurred in 1984 when Indian forces seized the undemarcated Siachen Glacier, a Himalayan region of 19,000 feet, and set up army outposts in the mountain ridges, which led to fighting in the second half of the 1980s, as the Pakistani Army also sought to gain control of the region. A period of alternating hot and cold relations, including many attempts to find resolution, led to increasing tensions in the late 1990s because of 1. Separatist activities in Kashmir that were covertly supported by Pakistan, and 2. Both countries carrying out nuclear tests in 1998. To ease tensions, in February 1999, both countries signed the Lahore Declaration aimed at resolving the Kashmir conflict. In early May 1999, Indian patrols discovered that their mountain outposts in the Kargil region were occupied by Pakistani militias. Subsequent reconnaissance revealed infiltrations in other locations. The scope of these intrusions, covering over 130 outposts along the mountain ridges of the Moshko Valley, Kaksar, Batalik, and Turtok, extending 100 miles in a 200 square mile area. The infiltrators had crossed the LOC into India-administered Kashmir during the winter months, when the Indian Army abandoned the outposts. Every winter, because of the harsh climate in the Kashmiri mountains, Indian as well as Pakistani units regularly abandoned their outposts, returning to them the following spring. Indian military planners surmised that the first infiltrations occurred in February 1999 to a peak in April. Contention exists as to who carried out the infiltrations. The Pakistani military has denied any direct involvement, stating that the infiltrations were made by Kashmiri militants, so-called Mujahideens or freedom fighters, who are currently engaged in an independent struggle for Kashmir. The Indian military disagrees, stating that from captured documents during the fighting and wiretapped conversations by Pakistani generals, the infiltrations were carried out by Pakistani troops and the Northern Light Infantry, a Pakistani Army-trained paramilitary. Furthermore, that as later evidenced by the infiltrators' adept fighting skills, only a force trained for high-altitude combat under extreme weather conditions could have been involved. And that after the war, Pakistan had awarded medals and military honors to many of its soldiers, which to India was further proof of Pakistan's military involvement. Apart from small firearms, the infiltrators possessed heavy weapons, mortars, artillery pieces, and anti-aircraft guns, and had laid anti-personnel mines in the outposts' forward positions. The Indian High Command also speculated that the infiltrations were aimed at shutting down the road link between Kashmir and Ladakh, compelling Indian forces to abandon the Siachen Glacier and thereafter forcing India into a negotiated settlement of the wider Kashmir issue. Or that the infiltration was meant to bring international awareness to the Kashmir dispute, or even that it was in retaliation to the Indian military seizing the Siachen Glacier. The Indian military has theorized that Pakistani preparations for infiltration may have begun in the 1980s and continued into the 1990s, but its implementation was put on hold for fear of inciting full-scale war. The Indian High Command quickly drew up plans to recapture the occupied territory. Initially, some 200,000 soldiers were assembled, which were trimmed down to 30,000 elite troops, as the 130-plus infiltrated outposts high up to 18,000 feet in the Himalayas required a specially trained force. The operation was hastened when on May 9, 1999, just 4 days after the discovery of the intrusions, the infiltrators opened an artillery barrage of an Indian ammunition depot in Kargil, and on June 1st, the shelling of the Kashmir-Ladakh highway. In mid-May 1999, now reinforced with more units, Indian forces launched their counteroffensive with an artillery bombardment of the enemy outposts overlooking the highway. At their peak, some 250 artillery pieces fired thousands of rounds a day. On May 26, Indian warplanes joined in the attacks, but the air sorties at such high altitudes encountered many difficulties and achieved less than optimal success. In May and into early June 1999, as neither the artillery nor air attacks failed to dislodge many enemy outposts, Indian forces launched infantry offensives to recapture the outposts by sheer force, using a slow ascent over sometimes steep terrain under cover of darkness at freezing temperatures. The outposts consisted of concrete bunkers stockpiled with weapons, ammunition, and food stores that allowed a relatively long period of fighting without the need for replenishment. Being located at heights of up to 18,000 feet, the outposts were nearly unassailable by an unsupported scaling attack up into the mountains. Despite these advantages, the outposts were meant to be self-contained and not cross-supported with each other. No adequate route existed from Pakistani-controlled Kashmir to the outposts for the movement of additional supplies. And the covert operation prevented the installing of a reliable communications network. The Indian ground offensive prioritized recapturing the outposts overlooking the Srinagar-Leh road. On June 9, 1999, Indian forces recaptured the enemy outposts in Batalik, and on June 13, more outposts in Totoling. On July 5th, Dras returned to Indian control. On July 8th, after a month-long battle, the strategic Tiger Hill also fell, as was the Jubar Heights in Batalik 1 day earlier. By early July 1999, many of the infiltrated areas had been recaptured. By then, Pakistan threatened to militarily intervene in the war. The threat of a wider conflict was made worse since both countries possessed nuclear weapons, and Indian and Pakistani leaders hinted at using these arsenals. The specter of a nuclear war greatly alarmed the United Nations, which put pressure on both sides. On July 4, 1999, the Pakistani government sought the assistance of the United States to resolve the conflict, and at the latter's urging, Pakistan called on the infiltrators to abandon the remaining outposts and return to the Pakistani side of the LOC. By then, apart from the UN, the European Union and ASEAN, two regional bodies, and even Pakistan's longtime ally China, were calling for an end to the fighting. Pakistan's economic situation was also growing desperate because of the Indian Navy's blockade of Karachi and other ports. By July 26, 1999, Indian forces had recaptured all occupied territory. Both sides claimed victory. After the war, India completed the construction of a security fence along the LOC and greatly increased surveillance of the de facto border. In August 1999, 1 month after the war ended, an Indian warplane shot down a Pakistani patrol aircraft, aggravating the already volatile situation. Then in 2002, the two nations nearly came to war, both deploying hundreds of thousands of troops on their common border following a Pakistani militant attack on the Indian parliament in December 2001. Both sides signed a ceasefire in 2003, but cross-border artillery fire regularly occurs along the LOC, with both sides blaming the other for the thousands of ceasefire violations that are reported each year. The dispute over Kashmir was further complicated in 1989 when Kashmiri separatists began their struggle for self-determination, with some elements calling for Kashmir's independence and others wanting unification with Pakistan. Mass demonstrations spiked in 2008 and 2016 that often degenerated into riots that caused hundreds of killed and injured. Kashmiri armed militias have also organized, which by the 1990s advocated jihadist views and Islamist fundamentalism. These militias have launched many attacks on government forces and facilities. As well, Pakistani Kashmiri militants have carried out attacks inside India itself. India has accused Pakistan of giving armed support to the separatists, which is denied by Pakistan, which says that it only provides moral and diplomatic support. The violence has caused over 40,000 deaths of civilians, security personnel, and militants. In 2019, India revoked Kashmir's autonomy and has since imposed direct rule over the region.